And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. The Naked City, the city of, well, I guess it's about 365,000 stories. Certainly a few very provocative ones are being told this week. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. In addition to our YouTube channel, we're podcasting now. You can find us Spreaker, on iHeartRadio, and now we're Spotify. I think somehow we've just managed to render Spotify permanently, hopelessly unhip. My children are horrified. But let's get down to it. It's a very busy night. The battle for civil liberties has never been more acute as it seems to be now at this point in our history. That's true both in the case of Rhode Island and nationally. We continue to replay our original broadcast from our days on WPRO, why you need to join the ACLU. And I'm proud of the fact that once again, joining me in studio is the Executive Director of the Rhode Island chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, which can be found at riaclu.org. Executive Director Stephen Brown. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Pat.
Well, he's got about a half hour or so I want to get right down to it. Two critical issues have reared their ugly head, seemingly within hours, and that just seems to be the way it is in Rhode Island. So let's first off take the national issue. Yesterday, Attorney General Barr, I believe, personal opinion, the host, not the guest, in a craven attempt to perform yet another Operation Change the Subject, is using the federal law to schedule the execution of 5 federal prisoners. Now, I believe it's been 17 years, you can check me on that, since a federal execution has taken place. To their eternal credit, the ACLU has already stood up and given the signs of what is going to be a protracted battle over this. I believe, again, the opinion of the host is that it's political theater at its worst, and effectively they're playing with civil liberties in order to, well, obscure some of the more arcane points of the Mueller testimony the other day. Stephen, is this a surprise to you guys? Did this happen just out of the blue? What's your thoughts?
I think you've hit it right on the head. This is an attempt to divert attention from the many other problems that I think the Trump administration is facing on a variety of fronts. It's bait for the people who support the president's political views. The death penalty is on its way out, one way or another. I think this is really a gasping effort by the federal administration to try to use a pun, put some life into it. But, across the country, there are more states that are repealing the death penalty. And I think people are recognizing, conservatives, liberals, on the left, on the right, just as a matter of economics, it makes no sense. It really does not solve the crime problem at all. It mostly is political theater, as you say.
Right. I mean, there's more than enough evidence to prove that it actually can exacerbate violent crime because of the desperate state that it will also put someone who is involved in a crime with the potential of the death penalty hanging like Damocles' sword over them. We've seen time and time again nationally that, in fact, good time laws and education is the methodology for which to reduce recidivism, to get people back into society. On the most egregious cases, it would appear that in every legitimate national poll, not the one that the Trumpistas invent on the fly, because they seem to make up a poll by the moment, that Americans almost exclusively favor life in prison without parole in an appropriate, humane setting over the death penalty. Is that your read on it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the death penalty is, by every conceivable method, more expensive than life without parole. The costs are enormous. And if you look at the crime statistics, it's the states that still have the death penalty that continue to have the highest violent crime rates, murder rates. So in terms of a correlation, there is none whatsoever. And as I said, there are now more and more states going the other way, recognizing it doesn't serve a purpose, and it should just be off the table.
Right. And in the 7:30 hour, Hannah Cox, who's the national manager for conservatives concerned about the death penalty, is going to be joining us via the miracle of Skype. for lack of a horrifically bad pun, I think it's time to put the death penalty to death. Is there any research, any attitude up at Smith Hill that it's time to recycle this? I know that there's rumblings every year, which is going to be agonizing, an incredible time waster for you.
It really has not been a big issue for at least over a decade now. Rhode Island has not used the death penalty for a very long time. The last person that was put to death in Rhode Island, most people now believe was innocent. Was a man named John Gordon, who people believe was the victim of anti-Irish prejudice at the time. So Rhode Island has a very concrete reason for not bringing back the death penalty. And I'm fairly confident that we will not see this coming here anytime soon. I think legislators on Smith Hill also recognize that it just doesn't make any sense from just about any perspective you have.
Yeah, just wrapping this up, one of the issues continues to be the I guess is it phenobarbital?
Yes.
Is the last approved and ironically available drug. There's still considerable questions about the effectiveness, and B, the humanity. Well, here we go. It's trying to project humanity onto an execution. Not sure how you do that, but if you were to go by conventional war standards, say the Geneva, or you would probably be strictly limited in how you could execute someone, even in the case of wartime. My understanding is nations continue to, I should say, the list of nations continues to expand on the prohibiting the import of any one of these cocktail mixes to execute prisoners. Is that?
That's right. In fact, the manufacturer itself has said that it should not be used for this purpose. It's not something they believe is appropriate. And a lot of the states that want to continue with the death penalty are having a difficult time actually procuring the drug. Some of them, according to lawsuits, have been trying to obtain it illegally because they can't lawfully obtain it. And there's a real irony to that, of course, the states themselves trying to violate the law in order to put somebody to death.
Right. And I'll sum it up with this. It's always been my conviction that even the most horrific personal tragedies should never translate into bad public policy. We have a constitution, we have ethics, we have a code, if you will, even if it seems unwritten these days, of human behavior, even if it's ignored at the highest levels of our executive branch here in this country. And I hope that one tradition continues. Everything else certainly is being trashed these days. That ultimately, when you look at the advance of science, when you look at organizations like the Innocence Project, as it's being carried on nationwide, that we would not sacrifice human life at the expense of either bad policing, lazy prosecution, or, again, public outrage at an horrific tragedy and then making that the policy of the country. I mean, that's, I would hope in the year 2019 that somehow we move beyond that.
And every month, it seems, we are seeing somebody released from death row after information comes out that they are in fact innocent of the crime for which they were convicted, for which they may have spent years or decades awaiting this punishment. So, it's not infallible. It's proven, unfortunately, all too often that our system is not infallible, which is just another reason to oppose the death penalty. And then I go back to the slogan that anti-death penalty advocates have been using for decades, which is, why do we kill people to tell people that killing is wrong? I think it's hard to get around that conundrum. It really doesn't make any sense.
And the reason why I appreciate, for example, Hannah Cox's organization, at least there are some conservatives who get the irony of ostensibly being against the growth of government and the intrusion of government's lives, with the notion that, in fact, the death penalty represents, the ultimate intrusion in public lives. If, in fact, the state is allowed to indiscriminately execute based on the opinions, if you will, of individual humans who we all know we are all ultimately fallible, then how does that constitute at any level being conservative? It simply doesn't. It's coming fast and furious in Rhode Island, if you will. In the next half hour, Dimitri Lyssikatos is going to be joining us in studio. He's awaiting out back. You and he have worked together for a couple of years now on a situation, an evolving situation that is sort of triangulated. On one hand, you've got courts, you've got states' attorneys generals, who, and let's be blunt, the style of the current attorney general, I would assume, in practice as well as politicking, is wildly different than his predecessor. But you've got a situation now, if I understand it correctly, where the states still reserve the right to withhold information, to essentially put a blackout on information of police behavior that was, that investigation of which was instigated by the police themselves. And in fact, we've moved beyond redaction. We've moved to a complete news blackout. Can you give us a history on this and how this evolved?
Sure.
And how did we get here? And should we be upset, disappointed with the Attorney General? There's this wave of hope that came in on a practical level and political level with his election. Is that diminished?
Not yet, no. This issue actually has a very long history. It goes back to the 1980s. There was a Brown University newspaper called The Rake that filed an open records request with the Providence Police Department looking for copies of the final reports of police misconduct investigations. There was lots of concern that people were filing complaints about police misconduct and they just sort of went in a trash can. So they wanted to get some data. So they filed this request, and the police department refused to hand it over, saying that this was private information exempt from disclosure. The ACLU represented them, went all the way up to the Rhode Island Supreme Court, and in a very important decision, the Supreme Court ruled that these records were public. The identifying information about the victim and the officer could be redacted, but the rest of the report was public so that individuals could find out what's happening with all these allegations and the investigations. Fast forward 15 or 20 years later, the community group DARE files a similar request for records, again gets denied, again the case goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court once again rules these records are public. There's an important public interest in being able to monitor what's going on with allegations of police misconduct. So that's pretty clear. There are two Supreme Court opinions, so one would think it's pretty clear. Unfortunately, what happened is in 2017, the Attorney General issued an advisory opinion that made a distinction between investigations of police misconduct that were generated by a citizen complaint, which happens to be the complaints that the two plaintiffs in the two lawsuits had asked for, and complaints that were internally generated by the police. That is, a police chief or somebody else gets wind of some shady business of a police officer, and they initiate the investigation themselves. Now, somehow, the Attorney General's office in 2017 decided there was a difference between these two types of complaints. The one was public, the ones that were internally generated were not. To this day, we do not understand the logic of that, but that's what they concluded. Dimitri, who you'll be talking with in a short while, and his organization, which is called the Rhode Island Accountability Project, which tries to collect all this information for the public, has been stymied. The Pawtucket Police Department in 2017, relying on this Attorney General opinion, refused to hand over to him any of the documents about police-generated misconduct complaints. We filed a lawsuit on his behalf. Unfortunately, earlier this year, a Superior Court judge approved the police department's position, at least in part, saying that they were not automatically releasable. The judge needed to review them to see if they should be released. We strongly disagree with that. We have filed an appeal to the Rhode Island Supreme Court to ask them to overturn that decision. In the meantime, Mr. Lyssikatos had filed a similar request with the Woonsocket Police Department. They came back with the same response as Pawtucket, relying on this AG opinion. So what we did in this case is that rather than appeal to the courts, we used another method that's authorized by the Open Records Law, and that is we filed the appeal with the Attorney General himself. And what we've asked the Attorney General to do in this case is overturn that 2017 opinion. We're asking him to conclude that it was wrong, that it should not remain the Attorney General's official interpretation of the law, and instead to rule that however the complaint is generated, the public has a right to know what the results of that investigation are. So this will provide the Attorney General an opportunity to show his interest in turning things around, not being like the past Attorney General. I mean, he's already done that, to be fair. He's already done that in one instance. You may recall we filed an appeal on behalf of former House Minority Leader Patricia Morgan, who'd filed a request with the Attorney General's office for all these Google settlement documents about how money was spent by that office when it received millions of dollars in funds from this lawsuit settlement. And the previous Attorney General redacted an incredible amount of information in handing over the records. Some of it was ludicrous, and the thing we always point to is he completely redacted a 2-page memo that dealt with the purchase of lapel pins for people in the Attorney General's office. So we filed an appeal, and then the new Attorney General, Nerona, took office, and he said, well, we want to review all this, hold off on the appeal while we review it, and the end result was they went through all the documents and eliminated almost all the redactions and gave a very different version of the papers to Representative Morgan. So that was a very positive step, and we're hoping that we'll see that continue as we give that office the chance to reconsider this really terrible 2017 opinion.
Right, and in his defense, he has inherited, at least on I'll call it a moral/political level, a mess. I mean, there is what's occurred over the past 3 or 4 years alone, in terms of databases, in terms of warrantless searches, in terms of just about everything. I believe is counter to quite everything that really Rhode Island civil liberty justice stands for. It's unfair to project on him this expectation that break glass, add Attorney General Nerona, add water, and somehow we'll get back to where we need to be. But it would be, I believe, and again my words, a real rebuke to the prior administration if in fact he took that stand in light of his action on former Representative Morgan's case.
I mean, there already has been a change. I think there's a change in attitude, a change in approach to these issues that is, very positive. As you can, we had lots of fights with the previous Attorney General on a whole range of issues, including open records, and I am very hopeful that we're seeing some change now. Right,
and you've also seen some significant changes in the office and how it's constructed. I mean, there are a cast of characters that gracefully have moved on. We wish them well to other lives in other places, and not the least of which, of course, are the folks who were involved in drug interdiction efforts and essentially supporting a loathsome war on drugs, which kind of leads me to the last issue, since we're kind of doing this kind of whirlwind roundup of stuff. Joining me later in the show, hailing the key of the Substance Abuse Policy Education and Recovery PAC, they made an announcement today. They are looking, obviously, to reverse what's generally referred to as the homicide law, whereas that, and again, please correct me, the issues are complex if I'm wrong, but essentially folks in the perimeter or someone involved in a transaction that leads to an overdose can be prosecuted for murder. Again, how, wow. When I look upon, you've got almost, when it comes to justice, my favorite cliche is in the halls of justice, justice is in the halls. We have this dichotomy here in Rhode Island. When I've had the good fortune to spend time with on the air and meet literally probably over a dozen of cooperating attorneys who volunteer their time largely for issues like this, who work with hand in hand with the ACLU, and that's how the system is designed to work. So I look upon that and I see, just anecdotally talking to libertarians in other parts of the country, that Rhode Island, amongst all states, stands at the top of that type of ethic, that type of ethos, for lack of a better word, that spirit of cooperation, of working with the ACLU in terms of I'm not going to imply that lawyers have a responsibility to do so, but recognizing the skills and the gifts that they've been given, utilizing it, if you will, for good instead of evil. And so I see that, and then I see this madness that's come out of the General Assembly, and one of them is the quote unquote homicide law. So they've issued a statement of that. Do you obviously reversing the law would be a dream.
It would be. I think it will be attempted. Again, this is something that dates back to the previous Attorney General. It was a major push by that office that got this law passed a year ago, and I think we're seeing the unfortunate fruits of it with what I assume you'll be talking to Haley about in a little while. The Providence Police are looking to use this law to try to charge people with murder because of some homicide deaths that have occurred in the past month. And it's important to understand the background. One of the real concerns that we and others have about use of this law is that it will deter people from calling for help, calling 911 when somebody is experiencing an overdose. If you know by calling 911 you may end up getting charged with murder, you're going to think a long time before you do that. And the idea behind a law that the General Assembly passed a few years ago called the Good Samaritan Law is that you shouldn't have to think twice. So what the Good Samaritan Law says is pick up the phone, call. You aren't going to be charged with any drug-related offenses for doing that. But Kristen's law this drug homicide law really undermines that goal. And it's one of the reasons so many of us are so concerned when police start rattling that saber and say, we're going to use this law to start arresting people and charge them with murder. We think it will have a very counterproductive effect on trying to deal with this very terrible crisis regarding opioid overdoses.
Right, and and a little bit more background. The Good Samaritan law had been passed. It's sunsetted. A year plus went by where, despite great public outcry, the current administration moved very slowly to move to reinstitute it. It crawled its way through the legislature. There were plenty of missed opportunities. It's finally being reinstituted, I believe without a sunset provision this time, I'm hoping. And yet again, you have this, if there's a constant refrain, it would appear that you have these warring clashes, these warlords within the General Assembly and the Attorney General's office who are each passing laws that render clear interpretation of other laws, as a civilian, if you will, almost chaotic. There's this insane desire to legislate the bench from the bench. I mean, they're out there trying cases essentially in Smith Hill, as opposed to the court system and the recovery system that should be, in my personal opinion, looking towards helping people with addictions, not funneling them right into the prison pipeline. It's beyond self-defeating. Yeah, we haven't learned from it, have we?
Well, yeah, there's no question there's a clash between the legislature that passed the Good Samaritan law and the legislature passing this drug homicide law. They really don't fit well together, and I think it's really important to have a consistent theme, a consistent process. If you want to deal with the opioid crisis, recognize it as a public health hazard that needs to be addressed from a public health standpoint, then you need to keep that in mind all the time and don't start coming up with exceptions like this other law that just has the opposite effect. So it is really unfortunate, but here's where we are, but that's why groups like Haley's group are speaking out to try to limit at least the use of this law while it remains on the books.
Does the Attorney General have, and this is what I love about having you on because we clear up the urban legends, does the Attorney General have the right or the ability or perhaps administratively to look beyond and simply not enforce this law? Or is that typically at the township level? How does that work?
No, yeah, these murder charges all go through the Attorney General's office, and prosecutors, not only in Rhode Island but across the country, have enormous discretion in deciding what they charge people with, or whether they charge somebody at all. So yes, it's certainly within the Attorney General's discretion as to how or whether to enforce a law like that, as it's true of every law. So yes, definitely.
So if he chooses to, he could, quote unquote, my words, do the right thing and simply ignore the law and then,
Yeah, I wouldn't call it ignoring the law. I'm not suggesting that he's really sort of violating the law himself. It's just that all these criminal laws give the Attorney General discretion. He has to decide, is there enough evidence to charge this person with a law, with a violation of the law?
Right.
Is it a good idea to do it, or should they be charged with something else? Is it really a crime? All these things always go into the determinations of what the person gets charged with. I wouldn't call it ignoring it. It's more exercising the discretion that prosecutors have to make those sorts of decisions,
right,
which can be for good or for bad.
Right. In summary, this was a difficult year for all of us in so many ways. There were so many, I hate to use the word defeat, because that I don't want to imply that organizations, particularly yours, didn't, what's the term, make yeoman's efforts to stem this tide, this constant tide. I don't want to trivialize it, but at times it must feel like, you're playing whack-a-mole civil liberties. I mean, you've got these recurring cases popping up. These folks are just kind of inventing laws on the fly. There's a whole other series of episodes I've done called Town Councils Gone Mad, where town councils are out there just whipping up their own residency laws, their own real estate laws, their own medical cannabis laws, just kind of winging it. There's a little bit of a break in the action. There's talk of a special session, but I don't think it's going to incorporate anything other than Providence schools at this point. Maybe IGT, maybe not. But is there a sense of mission now going forward? Are there priorities that you're going to stress in the coming year? Is there an attempt, or is there a way to perhaps pick out some of the more egregious laws, given perhaps the absence of any real argument from the current Attorney General, and actually try to make them go away?
Well, I think it's very hard to repeal a law once it's on the books. It's a lot easier to stop a bill from becoming law than trying to repeal one. So I think that's going to be difficult for whatever issue you have in mind. I think what we need to do is focus on moving forward, try to prevent any further damage to civil liberties from the laws that get passed, and look at proactive measures in a lot of different ways, and not just criminal justice. I think one really big issue that our legislature is way behind on addressing, that a lot of other states, red and blue, are dealing with, is technological privacy. Rhode Island has virtually no laws that address this new technology, especially technology that police use across the country. We're talking about facial recognition, the use of drones, gathering information on your cell phones. These are all really big issues. They're only getting bigger as time goes by. And a number of states have begun passing laws to try to limit government use of this information.
Right. And
Rhode Island has not so far. And I think that is one very big issue that we and others really need to start working on.
Well, as always, I'm incredibly grateful that you'd spend time on a Friday evening with us. I hope we see an email come across, and we try to get the word out as quickly as possible based on the information you're sending. I hope that whatever strategy you folks decide to move forward with as we approach another legislative session, continue to harness the effort of all these little good government groups like ourselves, and see if we can get behind and start to force these issues. I think you're right, spot on, because the potential, again, my words, for really poorly thought out, ill-worded, unintended consequence style law when it comes to privacy issues. I mean, we are a target-rich environment for that. There's been more bad law written in this state, I think, pound for pound, than just about anywhere. And it's to the degree that you can pull in the experts ahead of time, and perhaps educate, so that folks like us can educate the public to develop perhaps the political will to stand up against this madness. I think it's going to be critical. So I thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks again for inviting me.
Any big fundraisers coming up? Any, folks can always donate at riaclu.org. You have any events coming up this summer or early this fall?
We just had an event this past week. We had a legislative wrap-up event. We're pretty quiet for the summer, but in September we do have a few events coming up, including a banned books event that should be lots of fun. If you go to our website, which as Pat said is riaclu.org, There's a listing of events that are coming up, and I encourage you all to take a look.
Yeah, banned books. I'd love to talk to someone in your office about being part of that. That's, that's important.
It's very important.
In an era when real news is conflated with fake news, that's critically important now. And, we are in an age where somehow education, science, facts don't seem to matter. But that's the subject of another show.
And would be a big subject, too.
And the one thing I'm going to ask you about, and it's just plant the seed, I mentioned to you this on the phone a few weeks ago, my pet peeve, because that's how we do law here in Rhode Island. Someone's got a pet peeve.
Yeah,
is this notion that civil fines can be used to ultimately lead to either imprisonment or civil asset forfeiture of some fairly basic rights, occasionally conflated as privileges. I can think of no more regressive set of laws than taking someone who is in the working poor and rendering them incapable of going to work because they can't pay a fine, and the fine leads to additional fines, and then the fine ultimately leads to either license suspension or registration revocation. And to me, if somehow we can make that better, I think the potential to improve a lot of lives almost instantly has real potential.
I agree.
All right.
I don't disagree at all.
God bless. We'll talk on that.
Okay.
Folks, we're going to take a quick break now. Joining me in the next segment, Dimitri Lyssikatos. We're going to talk some more about his case. But again, we are the coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media. I want to thank Stephen Brown for joining us, as always. Folks, we're going to rebroadcast this week on our podcast why you need to join the ACLU, or at least why you need to afford it some support financially. We constantly get folks when we post that Stephen or one of the corresponding attorneys from the ACLU is going to be on the air, we constantly get this notion they don't do anything for 2A. They don't do anything for us. Well, to that I say balderdash, and that interview that we did so many years ago just lays it out beautifully. So if you can, for your own sake, for your own self-education, take a moment, right? Listen to it. You can skip over the parts where I talk. And listen to Stephen Brown and make a case both on the history and the services he's provided to virtually every resident of Rhode Island, regardless of your political, personal beliefs, regardless of your economic station, regardless of race, religion, whatever. Folks, we're going to take a minute break. We're going to get Dimitri right in, and we'll be right back.